I'm a priest, and I was called to Antarctica, but there's something buried in the ice, something they're not telling me. They reached out to me in the heart of winter, the season when the sun refuses to rise, when the endless night of Antarctica takes hold. I had no idea what awaited me. The instructions were sparse, almost veiled in secrecy, with only one clear directive: report to a research outpost near the pole, situated in one of the most desolate regions on Earth. When the plane touched down, a storm immediately seized the craft. The wind howled and battered the metal, almost as if trying to tear it apart. The sky above was a bruised shade of purple, ominous and foreboding, and the distant lights of the base flickered like ghostly stars. As I stepped onto the icy ground, an invisible weight pressed against my chest, heavier than the cold air around me. A young soldier, his face mostly concealed beneath a thick hood and goggles, approached, his posture stiff but visibly relieved to see the priest's collar peeking from beneath my heavy coat. "Father Martin?" he asked, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped tightly around his mouth. I nodded, gripping my bag tightly as the biting wind cut through every layer of clothing. "I am. And you are?" "Corporal Haynes, sir," he replied, standing upright. "They've been waiting for you. Please follow me to the briefing room." I followed, casting one last glance over the vast, endless expanse of ice. It stretched for miles, broken only by jagged cliffs and distant hills. The silence was absolute, profound, and unnervingly oppressive. It felt as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, but I pushed the unsettling thought aside as we entered the building. Inside, the outpost was cold and sterile, its walls made of harsh metal, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a sterile hum. Soldiers in heavy green coats stood silently, their eyes darting toward me, their glances laced with an unreadable tension. We walked down narrow, echoing corridors until Haynes stopped in front of a heavy steel door. He knocked, and a voice from within called for us to enter. The door creaked open, revealing a man in a sharp military uniform, older, with the undeniable air of someone used to command. He stood as I entered, his hand extended in a firm, deliberate greeting. "Father Martin," he said with a curt nod. "Colonel Beckett, thank you for coming." I shook his hand, sensing the firmness of his grip, and replied, "I wasn't given many details, Colonel. Only that I was needed here for something unusual." Beckett exchanged a brief, uneasy glance with Haynes, and I noticed the fleeting discomfort in his eyes. "Yes, we apologize for the lack of information. Some aspects of this mission, well, they're difficult to explain until you're here in person." I raised an eyebrow, the knot in my stomach tightening. "Explain?" He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "There's a formation nearby, a cave, to be precise. We discovered it while mapping the area. It's strange, almost like a natural monument. We've sent teams in and out, but it's not what we expected." Beckett's gaze fixed on me, and something dark flickered in his eyes. "I think it's better if you see it for yourself." The drive to the site was grim. The wind picked up, screaming against the sides of the vehicle as if trying to break through. Outside, the land was a frozen wasteland, broken only by jagged rocks protruding like the remains of some ancient creature long buried beneath the ice. Corporal Haynes drove in silence, his knuckles white against the wheel. I sat in the back, surrounded by two soldiers, neither of whom spoke. They kept their eyes on the windows, tense and rigid, as though the very land outside might turn hostile at any moment. Before we set out, Colonel Beckett had offered me little information. "The cave. It's something about it," he had said, staring down at a map, though his eyes seemed distant. We had a team survey when we first discovered it, but they didn't get far before things started happening. One of them he stopped abruptly, as if the words themselves scared him. What do you mean? Things started happening. I had pressed, though a part of me didn't want to know. Beckett looked at me, his face stern, but his eyes were full of something deeper, something close to fear. Degradation, paranoia, hallucinations. One man said he felt like he was being watched. Another claimed he heard voices whispering to him. They didn't get far into the cave before I pulled them out. It's as if the place has a presence. He cleared his throat. I don't believe in the supernatural, but my men do. They'll feel better with a priest along. As we neared the cave, those words echoed in my mind. A presence. The soldiers, and I said nothing. The vehicle finally came to a halt, and the silence that followed was suffocating, almost violent. We stepped out into the bone-chilling wind, and there, looming just a few yards away, it stood. A massive stone formation towered over us, half buried in the ice, its shape twisted and dark, like something that didn't belong in this world. It stood at least 150 feet tall and 50 feet wide, its black entrance yawning open, surrounded by jagged, menacing rocks. The snow around the formation had piled up unnaturally, as though the cave itself had disturbed the ice, causing it to shift and crack at odd angles. Private Mills, standing beside me, whispered, his voice barely audible against the wind. "Doesn't look right, does it?" "No," I whispered, swallowing hard. "It doesn't." Sergeant Davis, the tallest member of the group, attempted to cut through the thickening tension with a strained chuckle. "It's just a weird rock formation," he muttered, though his eyes never strayed from the looming cave entrance. "Nothing more." I glanced over at him, studying his stiff posture, the way his mouth tightened and his fingers gripped the rifle with a sense of unease. Each soldier held their weapons as though they anticipated something unseen lurking just beyond the threshold, waiting to spring. Davis broke the silence again, his voice rough. "Look, I don't know if you really believe in any of that priest stuff, but just stay close, all right?" I gave him a small, reassuring nod, though I felt a growing unease that I couldn't shake. "I'll stay close," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The soldiers visibly relaxed, just a little, with one last glance at each other. We began our approach toward the mouth of the cave. The wind howled around us, but it felt as though the sound was being swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the ice. Each step we took, the snow beneath our boots crunching loudly, only intensified the sense of isolation. As we drew closer to the entrance, the cave's gaping maw seemed to swell before us, dark and uninviting. My skin prickled, an instinctive awareness creeping up my spine. I felt as if eyes were watching us from within the blackness, cold, calculating, and patient. Private Mills, walking just ahead, stopped abruptly. His breath formed mist in the cold air, but his gaze was fixed on the snow just before the cave entrance. "Look," he whispered, barely audible. I followed his eyes, and there, half covered in the snow, were tracks. Bare, human footprints leading straight toward the cavern. They disappeared inside, swallowed by the darkness. The tracks were too small for an adult, and the cold was too intense for anyone to dare go barefoot in these conditions. "Oh," Corporal Haynes started, his voice trailing off in disbelief. Sergeant Davis cursed under his breath, his voice tight with dread. "No one's been out here recently, and no one goes barefoot in this weather. They'd be dead in minutes." I felt my fingers instinctively clutch at the silver crucifix hanging around my neck. Beckett's words echoed in my mind. There's something about it, a presence. The chill of the wind cut through me, but the cold that settled in my gut came from something far darker. Without another word, we advanced. The cave's entrance loomed larger with each step, the darkness within feeling like it was pulling us in, inviting us to venture deeper. The light from our flashlights flickered, casting jagged shadows along the walls, while the quiet of the storm outside seemed miles away. As we crossed into the cave, the last of the daylight vanished behind us, replaced by the unnatural, suffocating warmth of the air within. It was damp and heavy, pressing down on us like a physical weight. It smelled faintly of wet earth, but there was something metallic in the air too, something foreign. "Father," Sergeant Davis spoke up, his voice low, almost reluctant. His eyes avoided mine as he shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "Before we go any further, maybe you could say something. For luck." The others nodded, their faces drawn tight with tension. Despite their weapons and hardened training, they looked like frightened boys facing something far beyond their understanding. I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the creeping dread. "Almighty God, we place ourselves in your hands as we walk through this place. Shield us, guide us, and let your light be our way. Protect these men, keep them steady, and grant us the courage to see this journey through." As I spoke, a sound echoed in the cavern, a distant, low rumble. It was faint, like something moving beneath the earth. The grinding of stone. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the ice. It was as though the cave itself were alive, groaning in protest. The soldiers froze, their eyes darting toward each other, unsure of how to interpret the noise. Mills spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "You heard that, right? That wasn't just me. It's probably just the earth settling," Davis offered with a strained voice, though his usual confidence was faltering. "These caves are old, could be shifting ice, rocks settling, something like that." "Yeah," Haynes muttered, trying to sound certain. "Just rocks." I tucked my hand back into my jacket, pressing the cross against my chest. "We'll be all right," I said, though my own voice sounded hollow, even to me. We continued a single-file line, moving deeper into the cavern. The path narrowed as we descended, the walls slanting inward and pushing us closer together. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if it were charged with something unspoken. The ground underfoot felt strangely smooth, as though the stone had been polished by years of slow, unseen forces. The further we ventured, the more the rock shimmered, but it wasn't the sheen of minerals. It had a sickly, damp gleam to it, as if coated in some viscous substance that made the stones slick to the touch. There was a subtle warmth radiating from the walls, far too warm for the freezing temperatures outside. "Feels different in here, doesn't it?" Mills muttered, his voice shaking slightly. He was glancing around with unease. "I mean, shouldn't it still be cold?" Davis scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Just keep moving, Mills. It's probably a geothermal fissure or something. Heat trapped in the earth." His jaw was clenched tight as his gaze flickered around, unsettled by something beyond his control. As we continued, the path grew steeper, forcing us to bend lower. The air thickened, each breath harder to take, the smell of rot creeping in alongside the earthy scent. The walls felt closer now, pressing in from either side. The faint grinding noise rumbled again, distant yet somehow louder this time. It seemed to reverberate in my bones. The stone was slick under my gloved fingers when I reached out to touch it, a strange, wet sensation that left my skin crawling. I wiped my hand against my coat, but the feeling lingered, as if the cave itself had marked me. Feels weird, doesn't it?" Mills whispered, his voice strained. "Like we're not supposed to be here." "Keep quiet," Haynes hissed, but his voice was tight with tension. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, desperation flashing in them. "Father, is this..." I mean, do you feel anything strange here? I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the rising sense of panic. There's something here, I murmured, though I wasn't sure what it was. But let's just keep our focus. The soldiers nodded, their faces pale and drawn. We continued down the narrowing path, the silence between us heavy, pressing against our chests. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the cave was responding, reverberating with the vibrations of our presence. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls grew even narrower, and the air thickened, pulsing with a strange energy that resonated in my head, deep and unrelenting. I couldn't place the source of the throb, but it felt as if the cave itself were alive, watching us. Do you all feel that? Mills asked, his voice cracking. His face was pale, eyes darting nervously over his shoulder as he breathed rapidly. Just keep moving, Sergeant Davis barked, though his voice was strained and unconvincing. Nothing's here but rock. Keep your head on straight, but Mills didn't seem to hear him. His steps faltered, his eyes glazing over as he fixated on something just ahead. His breathing was uneven, and he seemed distant, lost. I reached out, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder, feeling the tense muscles beneath his uniform. Mills, I said softly, my voice firm yet gentle. Stay with us? He didn't respond, his body rigid, as if he were caught in some trance, staring at the unseen depths of the cave before us. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and in that moment, I knew we had crossed a point of no return. Private Mills' eyes were wide, his breath shallow, his hands trembling as he stared at something unseen, his voice barely a whisper. Father, I don't think I'm supposed to be here. His face was pale, like a man standing on the edge of a precipice. Something's looking at me, something I left behind. He touched his forehead, as though trying to steady himself, but the fear only deepened, leaving his voice fragile. I don't know why I ever. How could I have? His words hung in the air, trembling like fragile threads in a breeze. I felt my stomach twist, the weight of his panic pressing against me. What is it, Private? I asked, though I already feared the answer. The way he stared into the darkness, eyes darting in terror, told me something unspeakable had taken root in his mind. It's her, he whispered, his voice barely audible. My little girl, she's here. She's staring at me, but his breath caught in his throat and his hand shot to his mouth, as if trying to silence a scream. His pupils dilated as he looked into the shadows, as if tracking some invisible horror lurking just beyond the light. Her face, it's wrong. So wrong, she's so pale, like she's been dead for days. And her eyes. Mills gasped, stumbling back, his body trembling violently. The words died in his throat as his gaze locked onto something. Something I couldn't see, but that clearly haunted him. No, he whispered, his voice thick with dread. She's asking me why I left her. Why I wasn't there for her when she was sick. I tried, I swear I did, but... Sergeant Davis, his voice rising in a mix of anger and concern, barked at him. Private, snap out of it. But Mills didn't hear him. His voice was choked with a terror that I couldn't help but feel creeping over me too. She says I should have been there. She says I wasn't there when she needed me. And now she wants me to end it. To end everything, he muttered, his words turning colder and more frantic. She wants me to carve her back into me, to feel what she felt, to make up for what I've done. I could feel the cold sweat break out on my skin. Mill's eyes, once so full of life, now seemed to reflect something far darker, something incomprehensible, something that should not exist. His voice dropped to a hollow whisper, a sound that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. She says it's the only way. If I cut deep enough, maybe then I can take her place. Maybe then I can fix it. I reached out instinctively, grabbing his shoulder, trying to ground him. His skin was clammy, cold to the touch, his body shaking with a feverish intensity. I could feel him slipping away from me, and with that realization, a surge of dread like ice water flooded my veins. "Mills!" I shouted, my grip tightening as I fought to bring him back from the edge of madness. But his fingers were already twitching toward his belt, where the dull gleam of a hunting knife caught the weak light of our flashlights. "No," I whispered, but my voice faltered as he raised the blade, the expression on his face, one of a man lost in a nightmare, torn between the raw agony of grief and some twisted need to appease the ghost of his daughter. "She says it's the only way," he repeated, his voice trembling with a sickening resignation. "If I just cut deep enough, I can bring her back. I can make it right." The sound that had been vibrating through the cave grew louder, a constant, pulsing hum that seemed to sink into my bones. It felt like the walls themselves were alive and breathing, responding to the madness swirling in the air. I could hear the beat of the pulse in the air, matching the rapid thud of his heart, driving him to madness. "Mills, stop!" Haynes said, his voice thick with fear. He took a step toward him, but Mills didn't even seem to hear him. His eyes were fixed on the knife, now raised higher, his body swaying with some unseen rhythm. The knife's edge glinted as he moved it closer to his throat, and I felt the sickening reality settle in. This was no longer about the cave or the ghost he believed he saw. This was something darker, something deeper. "Father, please, help me," Mills whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at me, pleading. But there was no recognition in his eyes. His gaze was distant, lost in a world I couldn't follow, held captive by whatever force was pressing down on him. I grabbed his wrist, my hand now a vice around his trembling arm, but his body shook violently, as if fighting something far more powerful than me. The air around us thickened, charged with a malevolent energy that pushed in from all sides. I tightened my grip, calling on every ounce of strength I had left, even as my own heart hammered in my chest. "No," I said firmly, forcing my voice to remain steady, despite the tremor of fear that had crept into it. I closed my eyes briefly, taking a deep breath, knowing this was my only chance. "God Almighty, Lord of hosts," I said, my voice a steady prayer. "Banish this darkness from his mind. Cleanse him of this evil." Mill's body jerked, his eyes rolling back in a horrifying display of pain. His mouth opened and closed as though struggling to breathe, but I could see his frantic gaze starting to fade. Slowly, his grip on the knife loosened, his hand falling limply to his side as he crumpled to the ground. But it wasn't over. The pulsing throb of the cave had grown louder, sharper, and something in the air seemed to resist the prayer. The walls groaned, their vibrations intensifying. I felt it deep in my chest, as if the very earth was resisting us. I could hear it, the low hum, like the soft song of something ancient, and the deep, suffocating sense that something was still watching us. Mill's breath was shallow, his face slick with sweat. "Father," he gasped, his voice weak and filled with terror. "It's still here, it's still inside me." I held him close, the tremor still shaking his frame. "I know, but you are stronger than this. It's not real. It's just a lie." But as I spoke, the others, Davis and Haynes, began to move. Their eyes had lost focus, their minds drifting as if carried by the same unseen force that had claimed Mills. Davis's eyes glazed over, his lips curling into a strange, vacant smile. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his gaze turning toward the depths of the cave, where the walls narrowed and the darkness seemed to call to him. Haynes was just as bad. He stood beside Davis, mesmerized, as though they were both staring at something I couldn't see. "It's calling us, Davis. Can't you hear it?" I could only watch in horror as the men I had fought beside for so long walked deeper into the shadows, their bodies moving in unison, as if under the sway of some insidious influence. They didn't even look at me, didn't even speak. "Mills!" I shouted, grabbing him tighter, but he was barely conscious now, his body shivering uncontrollably. "No, don't let them go. You can still fight this." But the words were lost. The pulsing, rhythmic hum had grown so loud now. I could feel it in my bones, and I knew that whatever it was that called to them in the darkness had already begun to claim them, just as it had claimed Mills. "Davis! Haynes!" I shouted, but neither of them turned. They continued onward, deeper into the tunnel, moving with a strange, unwavering certainty as if guided by an unseen force. Their footsteps echoed, steady and mechanical, their backs disappearing further into the suffocating darkness. Mill's hand tightened around mine, his voice a frantic whisper. "They're walking into it, Father. Into it." A creeping dread coiled in my chest as I watched the two of them fade into the shadows, their movements smooth and almost hypnotic. I could barely hear them now, only faint murmurs floating back to me like disembodied voices from a dream. "Do you see it?" Davis's voice rang out, tinged with awe. "It's so warm. I can feel it like a heartbeat." "Yes," Haynes answered, his tone equally captivated. "It's been waiting for us, hasn't it? All this time." The words sent a chill through me, and I glanced back at Mills. He was trembling violently now, eyes wide with fear. "Father, don't let them go any further," he begged, voice raw. "It's feeding on them. It's pulling them in." I could feel his pulse hammering against my hand, frantic and erratic. I tried to reassure him, my voice shaky yet firm. "Stay with me, Mills. We'll face this together." But the light from their flashlights grew faint, swallowed up by the blackness ahead. And just like that, they were gone. Mills' grip tightened, his face a mix of panic and determination. "Father," he rasped, his voice breaking, "you have to go after them. You need to find them. Bring them back." I hesitated, torn between staying by his side and chasing after the two soldiers who seemed to be vanishing into some unseen terror. "I can't leave you here," I said, my voice unsteady. "No," Mills insisted, his voice low and strained. "You have to go. I can hold my ground here, but they won't make it if you don't go after them." His words struck me like a blow. I knew he was right. Every moment we lingered here, the further Davis and Haynes would drift into whatever hell awaited them. With a quiet blessing on my lips, I gave Mills a final look and ventured deeper into the cave, the weight of his trust heavy on my shoulders. The path grew narrower, the air growing warmer, thicker with each step. The walls pulsed, almost alive, and the ground beneath my boots seemed to shift with every movement. My footsteps echoed eerily, swallowed by the crushing silence, as I called out their names, though I knew it was pointless. Nothing answered but my own voice, bouncing off the jagged stone like a ghost whisper. A cold, unsettling feeling began to creep up my spine as I continued, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. Just when the panic started to rise in my chest, I saw it, a flicker of movement ahead. A figure, small and pale, stepping quietly from the blackness. At first, I thought it was an illusion, but then it took shape. A child, no older than 7 or 8, with skin as white as snow and hair that shimmered like gold in the dim light. He stood there, barefoot and dressed in an oversized white shirt, his eyes unervingly bright, radiating an unsettling mixture of innocence and wisdom. His smile was warm, too warm, but there was something wrong about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Hello, Father," the child said, his voice almost musical, soft and lilting. "You're looking for your friends, aren't you? But it's too late. They're already leaving us." A chill gripped my chest, fear spreading like ice in my veins. "What do you mean? Where are they?" The child's smile widened, and his eyes darkened with a strange amusement. "They're lost now. They were afraid, Father. They needed something to cling to, but you left them. Just like you left Mills." His words stung, sharp as a blade. My mouth went dry, and I fought to steady myself. "Mills wanted me to go on," I said, my voice faltering, unsure of myself. The child tilted his head, his smile too wide, too knowing. "He asked because he knew you wanted to leave him," he said, his voice dripping with a coaxing sweetness. "Mills wanted someone to stay with him, someone to hold him through his fear. You left him, and now he's found his way out." I staggered, horror clawing at my insides as the truth of his words sank in. "You're lying," I whispered. Mills is okay." The child's expression shifted, sympathy mixed with something darker. "You'll see," he said softly, almost fondly. "You left him to die, and now he's gone. And he's not the first you've abandoned. Is he, Father?" My breath hitched in my chest. The child's words cut deep, like a wound I didn't even know I had. His voice twisted the knife, exposing things I had buried long ago. My failures, my isolation, the vows I had taken. The child's gaze softened, but there was nothing kind about it. "You've given up everything, haven't you? A life of loneliness. No wife, no children, just service. All you've ever received in return is emptiness. You've sacrificed so much." His voice echoed in my mind, a haunting whisper I couldn't escape. I had spent years trying to fill the hole within me, praying for something to fill that void. I had lived my life in solitude, always waiting for something that never came. "You deserve peace, Father," the child continued, his voice now smooth and coaxing. "You've served long enough. God sees your suffering. He wants you to rest. He wants to free you. If you just let go, he'll welcome you. He'll take you in, a martyr, a saint." The child stepped closer, his hand reaching out for mine. His touch was ice cold, sending a shock of dread through me. "If you end it now, God will still love you. He'll forgive you, and you'll never be alone again." A rush of conflicting emotions surged through me. My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled with the weight of his words. His promises seemed so sweet, so tempting. All the years of pain, the emptiness I had carried with me, all of it seemed like it could finally be over. The child's gaze was mesmerizing, his smile almost too perfect, too inviting. I felt a deep pull toward him, a temptation to surrender to the peace he offered. The thrum of energy in the cave grew louder, almost in sync with my heartbeat, urging me to let go, to find the comfort I had never known. But deep inside, something refused to let go. A small, stubborn spark of resistance. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the familiar shape of my rosary. The weight of it was a lifeline, grounding me in the midst of this nightmare. With trembling hands, I closed my eyes and began to pray. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The child's face darkened, his smile faltering as he watched me. "Father," he said, his voice soft but filled with a trace of venom, "you're clinging to something that can't help you here. Those words, they're meaningless. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." The child's grip on my hand tightened painfully, and his expression twisted with anger. "You don't have to do this, Father," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You're wasting your time. God won't hear you here, and she doesn't care. Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." The child recoiled, his face contorting in frustration as the final words of my prayer echoed through the cave, resonating against the stone walls. The atmosphere grew heavy, suffocating, but I held firm, gripping the rosary tightly, praying for deliverance. The boy's face began to change before me, his once soft features stretching and shifting in unnatural ways. His skin lost its warmth, becoming a sickly yellow, while his eyes darkened, as if drained of all life. His small limbs grew unnaturally thin, extending into long, bony arms, and his fingers twisted into sharp, claw-like shapes. His mouth opened into a twisted grin, revealing uneven, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. I took a step back, clutching my rosary tightly, as the childlike figure before me transformed into something else entirely, something sinister and unnatural. "You think you can resist me?" The creature growled in a voice that was no longer childlike. It was deep and menacing, vibrating through the air and making the very walls around us seem to shake in response. "You're standing inside me, priest," it sneered, gesturing to the walls. "This place, this entire cave is mine. You walk through my veins, feel my breath in the rocks, hear my pulse in the silence. You are nothing but a speck in my world." The walls seemed to shift subtly, pulsing with a sickening, organic rhythm. A faint, eerie sound echoed in the distance, like a heartbeat that never stopped. "You and your friends will never leave," it continued, its voice growing colder with each word. "I will take each one of you, consume you, and bury you in the depths of my domain." Its form quivered, expanding and growing more menacing. Shadows began to slither around it, dark shapes reaching toward me, as if seeking to pull me into the void. The weight of the air around me grew heavier, suffocating me. But in an instant, the creature vanished, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only an unsettling silence behind. I took a deep breath, clutching my rosary in an attempt to steady myself. The stillness was suffocating, and then I saw them, Davis and Haynes, standing near a dangerous drop in the cave, their backs turned, their faces fixed downward. They were speaking in hushed tones, their voices strained and broken, as though communicating with something unseen. "Davis," I called, moving closer, but they didn't respond. Their eyes were glazed, unfocused. Davis still held his rifle, the barrel pointed toward his jaw. Haynes was clutching a knife, the blade pressed against his wrist, trembling. I felt a wave of terror as I understood what was about to happen. "No!" I cried out, rushing toward them, but they seemed unaware of my presence, trapped in their own torment, their faces distorted with silent agony. "Mother," Davis whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. I can't live with this anymore." Haynes echoed his sorrow, his voice distant. "I'll see you soon, Sam. I'll make things right. I'll make it right. Stop!" I shouted, rushing toward them. "Please don't do this. It's not real. Whatever you're seeing, it's a lie. This place is deceiving you." For a brief moment, they hesitated, their grips loosening, the tension in the air easing. But the shadows around them seemed to tighten, drawing them back into their despair, feeding on their sorrow. "Davis, Haynes," I said, my voice trembling but determined. "Listen to me. You are not alone. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you think you see, it's not real. I'm here. We are in this together. But before I could reach them, Davis's hand tightened around the rifle. The gunshot rang out, loud and sharp, echoing through the cave. I watched in helpless horror as Davis collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground, his eyes distant, his face frozen in an expression of anguish. The shadows seemed to swell around him, swallowing his very essence. "Davis," I whispered, my voice breaking, but he was gone. Haynes, now alone, his face pale, continued to press the knife against his wrist. He sliced through the skin, blood flowing freely. His body swayed as if fighting to stay upright. "No!" I cried out, rushing to his side, grabbing his wrist to stop the bleeding. My hand slipped in the blood as I worked quickly, trying to stop the flow. I tore open the emergency kit on his vest, fumbling for the tourniquet, wrapping it around his arm and tightening it as best I could. "Haynes, stay with me," I urged, my voice steady but filled with fear. "This place is tricking you. It's feeding on your pain. You don't have to give in." He blinked, his eyes unfocused at first, but then they began to clear. "Father," he whispered. I saw him. My brother. He was calling me. "It's not real," I said firmly, pressing my hand to his shoulder. "This is all in your mind. We can still make it out of here. Together." I began to recite a prayer under my breath, holding my rosary tightly. Haynes's breathing slowed, and I could see the tension ease from his body. His eyes cleared, and he gave me a faint nod, gripping my hand as if it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. Thank you, Father," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Just then, a voice I recognized echoed through the cavern, joining in my prayers. I looked up, startled, to see Mills emerging from the darkness. His face was set in determination, his lips moving rapidly in prayer, his voice a steady rhythm against the dark forces that pressed in around us. "I came because she told me to," Mills said, his eyes bright with resolve. With Haynes leaning on me and Mills at my side, we turned to leave, making our way back up the twisted path. Every step felt like a struggle, as the walls of the cave seemed to close in, growing tighter with each movement. "Move faster," Mills urged, grabbing my arm and pulling me forward. The tunnel warped and bent unnaturally, its angles defying all logic. Haynes, pale and weak from blood loss, leaned heavily on us, but he kept moving, though each step seemed more labored than the last. A deep growl rumbled through the ground, shaking the walls around us. The earth beneath our feet cracked, the very stones shifting as if alive. The walls seemed to take on new shapes, twisting into monstrous forms, hands reaching out, eyes staring from the darkness, mouths gaping open in silent hunger. "Keep praying," Haynes whispered. "It hates that." I raised my voice, determined not to let the darkness take hold. My words echoed through the cavern, a defiant cry against the evil that surrounded us. Mills's voice joined mine, strong and unwavering, and Haynes, though weak, whispered the prayers along with us. "Deliver us, Lord, from every evil," I chanted, my heart pounding with each step, but the tunnel seemed to grow longer, stretching out to mock us. Still, we pressed on, refusing to let the shadows win. The walls screamed in fury, a high-pitched, haunting sound that scraped against my mind, but I held on to my faith. The rosary in my hand felt warm, like a beacon of light in the suffocating darkness. And then, through the oppressive blackness, I saw it, a faint sliver of light, small but unmistakable. It grew brighter, piercing the gloom as we pushed toward it, each step bringing us closer to salvation. With one final surge of strength, we stumbled into the cold, clear air of the outside world, leaving the darkness behind. We had escaped. I felt Haynes slump against my shoulder, his weight sagging with every step as Mills supported him on the other side. The men were completely drained, their faces pale and their breaths ragged, but we had made it out. We had escaped. The ground behind us trembled violently, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow the cave hole. The entrance quaked, the stone shifting unnaturally, groaning under some unseen pressure. Shadows inside the cavern danced, twisting and writhing in frantic motion, like they were alive, struggling to break free. And then, in one horrifying instant, the cavern collapsed in on itself. The walls caved in, crumbling under some unseen force as if the earth was eager to close its jaws on us forever. A guttural roar echoed up from the depths, vibrating through the ice and snow. We heard the cavern's final scream as the ground buckled, devouring the entire hellish structure until it was nothing but a patch of empty snow and jagged rock. "Run!" I shouted, my voice strained as I urged Mills and Haynes to move faster. Feeling the ground beneath us lurch and heave, the land itself rebelling against our presence. We scrambled up the ridge ahead, the cold biting into our skin, the snow refusing to let go of our boots, as if it too wanted to pull us back down. We barely managed to make it to the top when another earthquake hit, a violent shockwave that threw us off balance, almost knocking us to the ground. Below, the spot where the cave had been was now sinking, as though the earth had opened up to swallow everything into its depths. Snow and rock cascaded into the growing chasm, falling into an abyss that seemed endless, an unholy maw that seemed to hunger for the lives of those who had dared trespass. I watched in a mix of awe and terror as the land folded over itself, disappearing without a trace. Mills staggered back, his hand clutching his head, his face drawn with disbelief. God, it's like it was never even there. Haynes, still grimacing from the pain in his arm, nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "It's just gone." We stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping into our bones, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. The presence, the cave, that unspeakable force. It was all buried beneath the ice now, hidden away, as though the earth itself had decided to seal away the evil that had lurked there. After what felt like an eternity, I reached out and placed a hand on Haynes' shoulder, nodding toward the distant lights of the base camp. "Let's go," I said quietly, my voice barely above the wind. "You need medical attention." The trek back to the base was eerily silent. We didn't speak, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our minds haunted by what we had witnessed. I led the way, the faint warmth of my faith keeping me moving, the cold wind clawing at us like a living thing, a constant reminder of the isolation we felt. The harsh, unforgiving landscape stretched out before us, empty and desolate, like the world itself had been drained of life. When we finally reached the base, Colonel Beckett was waiting for us, his expression unreadable as he studied us all. His gaze lingered for a moment on Haynes' blood-soaked arm, and then it shifted to Mills, whose face seemed hollow, eyes glazed over in a way that made my stomach twist. Wordlessly, he gestured for medics to take the two men, and I watched them lead Haynes and Mills away, their expressions tired, far too tired. The colonel and I were left standing together in the biting cold, the night silent except for the distant howling wind. He turned to me, his eyes sharp, 1,000 unspoken questions hovering in the air. His voice was low, steady. "Well, what happened down there?" I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. How could I explain it? How could I describe the terror we'd faced? The feeling of being swallowed whole by something not of this world. How could I possibly make sense of it all? I hesitated, searching for the right words. I finally met his gaze. It was something evil, Colonel. Something beyond what we could understand. I don't know what you were hoping to find, but whatever that was, it's better left buried. You don't want to know. The Colonel's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly, his face unreadable. His eyes flickered briefly to the place where the cave had once been, the memories of that darkness hanging heavy in the air between us. And Sergeant Davis? Davis didn't make it, I said, my voice quieter as the weight of the loss settled in my chest. But Mills and Haynes, they'll recover. Physically, at least. He nodded, a small gesture of sympathy flickering in his eyes. I'm sorry, Father. I didn't know it would turn out like this. Neither did I replied, clutching my hands together, fingers brushing the rosary that had been my constant companion. But it's over now. Whatever was down there, whatever that thing was, it's gone. It's buried. The Colonel watched me, his expression lingering with unsaid thoughts, questions he would never voice. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but even he couldn't deny the truth of what had happened, the shadow that had crept over us all. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. Thank you. As I prepared to leave Antarctica, I couldn't shake the uneasy sense of peace that mixed with a deep sorrow. The darkness that had nearly consumed us, the thing buried beneath the ice, had been sealed away. For now, as I boarded the plane, I whispered a final prayer, my heart heavy with the knowledge that whatever evil had once thrived beneath that frozen wasteland was still there, hidden, waiting. I could only hope that it would remain locked away, buried for all time.